Welcome to the Sprout Out Loud podcast. I'm your host, Allie McGowan, a registered dietitian on a mission to help others navigate confusing nutrition information. Each week, we'll explore practical strategies for improving metabolic health and building lifestyle habits that support lasting change. My goal is to equip you with the tools and insights to take control of your health and make informed choices that work for you. All right, welcome back to the Sprout Out Loud podcast. Thanks again for being here, guys. We have episode 5 today. Today I'm talking about sleep. Sleep is one of those topics that I feel like a lot of people struggle with, and it may not be the first thing that we think of if we're sort of struggling to maybe see progress in our nutrition or fitness or health journey. A lot of times when I'm meeting with someone for the first time, we run through a number of questions, just sort of like getting to know each other. And one of the questions that I always ask is, how is your sleep? And tell me a little bit more about your sleep. And sometimes the look on people's faces is like, why is this girl asking me about my sleep? Isn't she a dietitian? I thought we were talking about nutrition. And the answer is yes, I am a dietitian and we are focused on nutrition here. Sleep has a pretty big impact on things like our appetite, our blood sugar, our executive function, so sort of our ability to make decisions and carry out things like meal planning or meal prepping. And so when we really take a deeper dive into how sleep affects those things, it can make it a lot easier to understand why sleep is so important. I like to say that sleep sort of seals the deal. And sometimes people are doing everything in their ability to improve their health. Maybe they're making really solid nutrition changes. Maybe they're making really solid lifestyle and movement changes. If sleep is something they're consistently falling short on, we may not actually really see the progress happening. And so sometimes my recommendation is let's actually prioritize your sleep. So today I'm going to be talking about why sleep is important, what it affects as far as metabolism and whatnot. I'm also going to talk about, at a very high level, just the 2 hormones that help to regulate our sleep-wake cycles. I'm going to focus mostly on what happens when we don't get enough sleep. And this includes even just one night of poor sleep. In this episode, I'll cover a lot of the science behind what happens, but I will also share some personal anecdotes because sleep is something that I struggled with pretty intensely for about 2 years of my life. I had insomnia, which was, I don't say that lightly. It wasn't, I had a bad night of sleep here. It was legitimately, I would be awake until 4 a.m. on a very, very consistent basis for about 2 years of my life. It was not fun. My sleep is much, much better now, but I'm also going to share my personal experience with sleep and how that sort of affected me. And then I'll also briefly touch on how we can support good sleep. This is meant to be a high-level overview. I'm going to focus more on strategies to support good sleep that aren't super obvious. Sleep is a very big topic, and I think we all are aware of certain things like getting sunlight early in the morning and not exposing ourselves to blue light late at night. I'm going to be focused more on the nutrition, fitness, and whatnot side of all of this. I do briefly touch on some nutrients in foods that are also supportive of good sleep. If this is something that you're interested in me doing a deeper dive on, whether that's in a podcast episode or another form of content like a mini guide, you can let me know. I have a request form in the show notes, and you can also message me on Instagram. And my handle is @SproutOutLoud, SPROUTOUTLOUD. And then lastly, if I mention a study here, I did include the link to that study in the show notes as well if you would like to nerd out on some science. Most of you probably don't. That's just me. Okay, here we go. So we're going to get into why sleep is important. And a lot of this is going to be reflective in what happens when we don't get enough sleep. But at a very high level, sleep is going to affect things like our blood sugar control. Sleep is going to affect our appetite and our cravings. Sleep is going to affect the release of certain hormones as they relate to appetite, but also our sex hormones. Sleep is going to affect things like recovery, and that includes recovery from stressors, such as maybe the stress that you have from work, but also other stressors like physical activity. Sleep is going to affect our executive function, which describes maybe how we make decisions, how we complete tasks. All of that is going to affect things like maybe meal planning, meal prepping, or even decision making around food. And then sleep is, of course, going to affect our energy. So if we're short on sleep, we might be reaching for foods that are going to give us that quick energy hit. And we might be less inclined to, do things that require energy, whether that's cooking or exercising. So at a very high level, there are 2 hormones that help to regulate our sleep-wake cycle. I share this just because I reference these later in the episode. So first one you've likely heard of is cortisol. Cortisol is often referred to as our stress hormone. I like to think of it as our sort of get up and go hormone. This is what helps to get us up and out of bed in the morning. And our cortisol levels are going to rise in the morning and start to decrease as the day goes on. We also have melatonin, which is sort of what helps us to wind down. Melatonin is going to work inversely to cortisol. And so our melatonin levels are going to be lowest in the morning, and they're going to increase and become highest at night. So this sort of explains why we wake up and why we fall asleep. So before I get into how we can even support good sleep, we're going to talk about what happens after even just one night of poor sleep. And these effects would be pronounced if you dealt with chronic sleep deprivation. So if we're going nights, weeks, months on end with consistently not getting enough sleep. First thing I'm going to focus on, because this is one that comes up a lot in my visits, is after one night of poor sleep, you may notice that you're much hungrier. And if you are someone who is chronically not getting enough sleep, this may just be your baseline. You may just think that this is sort of normal for you. And there is a shift in our hunger and fullness hormones that happens after one night of poor sleep. So the hormone ghrelin is what stimulates our hunger and encourages us to eat. And the hormone leptin is what stimulates our fullness and sort of tells us, okay, we've eaten and we've had enough food, and so we're going to sort of resolve this hunger. So after one night of bad sleep, we see that our levels of ghrelin are increased, so we are going to feel hungrier. And as if that weren't enough, our levels of leptin will also be decreased. So we will be feeling hungrier, and we will also be feeling less satisfied or less full from the foods that we're eating, often leading us to need to eat more food. This is not meant to scare you. This is meant to sort of just provide an explanation for that hunger. A lot of times, again, people feel like I'm crazy or I don't have enough willpower. Why am I so hungry? But if we're not sleeping, there is a legitimate shift in these hormones. The good news is that leptin levels are thought to be restored to their baseline after a good night of recovery sleep. And so I think a lot of times we need to be cognizant of paying back that sleep debt. So for example, let's say that I need 7 hours of sleep, right? Most nights I feel good with 7. And let's say one night I only get 5. Well, getting 7 hours the next night is only achieving that 7 hours. It's not sort of paying back that 2 hours of sleep debt that I missed. And so I think when we talk about recovery sleep, we're talking about making up for that deficit, which, is easier said than done. We don't want to be perfectionists about our sleep either. Okay, so in addition to feeling hungrier, we are probably going to gravitate more towards higher carb and higher fat foods. And so I touched on this concept of hedonic versus homeostatic hunger in my last episode on emotional eating. Hedonic hunger is like our desire to eat for pleasure versus homeostatic hunger is eating sort of more from a utilitarian perspective or simply because we need food for survival. There have been a number of studies that have shown that poor sleep, and when I say poor sleep, I mean around 5 hours or less, can disrupt our circadian rhythm and actually increase our hedonic drive for food. So again, that's that desire for eating for pleasure. And this is going to, again, maybe drive us to have more of those high carb, high fat foods. We see this a lot in night shift workers. And again, there have been studies on this as well. These people who are sort of experiencing these chronic disruptions in their sleep-wake cycle. So maybe someone who works the night shift, or for people who maybe work swing shifts where they're working a night shift for a period of time and then a day shift for a period of time. We see that these effects may be magnified for these people. And again, it's just a sort of like chronic disruption in our circadian rhythm. This may also be tied to changes in our blood sugar that happen after a night of poor sleep. And so sleep is going to play a pretty big role in insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance. This basically means that sleep is going to help our body effectively regulate our blood sugar. So some research shows that sleep deprivation, and in this particular study, they say that sleep deprivation is less than 7 hours. And if you're thinking, okay, 7 hours would be really good for me, I just want to say that you're not alone in that. That's just what this one study shows. One night of poor sleep is going to increase insulin resistance and decrease glucose tolerance the following day. This just means that the hormone insulin, which helps to regulate and control our blood sugar, is not going to do its job as effectively. This also means that when our blood sugar rises, it may stay elevated for a longer amount of time. Having your blood sugar rise after eating a meal is absolutely normal. We don't necessarily need to eliminate these rises in blood sugar levels. What we don't want is for our blood sugar to sort of be up and down and up and down and up and down, or up and chronically elevated and then down. We want, if we sort of like envision that pattern in our head, this would look like, mountains or spikes. We want more like gentle rolling hills where our blood sugar sort of rises and falls slowly over an extended period of time. And because of maybe this increase in insulin resistance and this decrease in glucose tolerance, our blood sugar is probably going to be a little bit more out of whack the day after a night of poor sleep, even if we are building balanced meals that would otherwise support blood sugar control. At one point, I actually wore a continuous glucose monitor for about 3 months, and it was very, very interesting because I did see this reflected in my CGM, my continuous glucose monitor, where I would have the same meal, and if I didn't sleep well the night before, my blood sugar levels would fluctuate. And this is important for a couple of different reasons, because when we think about cravings, oftentimes our cravings are going to be the result of that blood sugar dip, right? So if we think about our blood sugar going up and coming back down really, really quickly, our body is going to want to bring that blood sugar back up to a normal level to sort of help regulate that. And one of the ways that it's going to do that is by encouraging us to maybe have a food that's high in carbs to bring that blood sugar back up. And that may come in the form of a loud signal to eat these foods. In other words, a craving for something that is starchy or high in carbs or salty or sweet. So from like a craving perspective, if we struggle with cravings, then that can be really disruptive to our day. It can be really distracting. It can be this other obstacle that we sort of have to overcome and deal with. But beyond that, we do know that these chronically elevated levels of blood sugar are a risk factor for conditions like prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. Again, the intent is not to scare anyone, but to just sort of reiterate that if you have sort of been putting your sleep on the back burner and you have the means within your life to improve it, maybe this is motivation to do so. I understand people are in different life stages, whether you're a new mom or you're working multiple jobs or your life is just particularly stressful at this time. It may not be possible for everyone to make all of these changes. But even if there's one thing that you take away from this episode that you can implement to improve your sleep, I would say that's a win. Next thing, after a night of poor sleep, we don't recover from stressors, whether those stressors come from life, from work, or from exercise, and we may then stay stressed as a result, right? So if we think about my stress is elevated and I'm never sort of recovering from that, that stress is going to sort of remain elevated for an extended period of time. And so this may lead to chronically elevated levels of cortisol, again, that stress hormone, which is amazing in short term, right? If we think about that stress hormone, maybe waking us up in the morning or even helping us to get out of a particularly stressful event. But but cortisol is not something that we want to be elevated all the time. Speaking of recovery, we know that recovery is going to be very, very helpful for performance in the gym, not just by helping you have a better workout because you got good sleep, but also by helping you to put on muscle. right? Sleep is really crucial for the process of building muscle. This is called muscle protein synthesis. You don't necessarily have to remember that term, but we see from the research that even short instances of sleep deprivation can decrease muscle protein synthesis. And so when we talk about actualizing your gains in the gym, we talk a lot about how, your progress is made in your recovery. And so that may include not just taking rest days, but making sure that we are getting enough sleep. Again, not to bring this back to me, but I actually really did notice that once I started sleeping better, even though my workouts didn't change, even though what I was eating didn't change, I finally started to put on muscle. And a couple of other things, if we are chronically underslept and that leads to chronic stress, this may lead to chronic inflammation, which could affect things like water retention. It could affect things like our immune system taking a hit. And so you may notice that if you're chronically sleep deprived, for whatever reason, that you tend to get sick more often. And that's because when we sleep, our body actually produces certain proteins that support the immune system. These are called cytokines. And so if we are chronically underslept, then we may have fewer of those proteins that, again, help to defend and protect the immune system. This next one I think is super interesting because I'm really interested in gut health, but even fragmented sleep or short sleep can actually affect our gut bacteria and can lead to something called gut dysbiosis, which is basically an imbalance of good to bad bacteria in the gut. And so there are a variety of reasons why someone may experience digestive issues like gas or bloating, but it could also be that if we think about sleep deprivation being a stressor, and we know stress really affects the gut, if you find that no matter what you eat, you're sort of having these digestive woes, it could also be because we're just simply not getting enough sleep. And then lastly, sleep will affect our sex hormones. So sleep is when the brain signals the release of specific sex hormones. So things like luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which can control ovulation in the menstrual cycle, as well as testosterone. Poor sleep may reduce these signals, so that may lead to lower levels of things like estrogen and progesterone or testosterone. And then sleep deprivation also raises cortisol, which can sort of further interfere with hormone signaling across the board. Okay, and so if you're someone who's sleep deprived and you're like, oh God, now I'm stressed out by all of this, that's not the intent here. The intent is to just say, if you have, again, the means to improve your sleep and you're struggling to see progress or you're struggling with some of the issues mentioned here, like, for example, maybe you're like, why am I not building muscle? And you have the means to improve your sleep. Well, it might be worthwhile to sort of explore some of these recommendations for how to do that. So here are a few ways that we can sort of optimize our sleep and optimize our circadian rhythm. The first one is if you are someone who habitually skips breakfast, it may be worthwhile to see what happens when you start eating breakfast and to see if that impacts your sleep. So when we eat earlier in the day, that's actually going to help to align our body with our circadian rhythm. And so if you are someone who consistently skips breakfast, whether because your schedule is rushed in the morning or you just don't have time or you're not hungry or you are intentionally intermittent fasting, we do know that this delayed eating schedule may sort of mess with our circadian rhythm, which could then affect our sleep. Beyond that, if we think about what happens when someone is skipping breakfast, that's typically going to lend to eating more later at night. And so if we're going to bed, shortly after eating dinner, and our dinner is pretty big because we maybe only had 2 meals or we didn't eat enough earlier in the day, well, that would then affect our blood sugar, which could then affect our sleep. Intermittent fasting is not something I'm going to dive too deeply into today. I am happy to talk about that in the future. I think men actually have a much better go at intermittent fasting than women for a number of reasons. But some research shows that people who follow an early time-restricted feeding window, in other words, let's say they eat only from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. rather than from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m., that may support better blood sugar control and sleep. And so this goes into the next tip, which, is not always possible, but if possible, aiming to eat your last meal anywhere between 2 to 3 hours before bed. I also think there's absolutely something to be said about going to bed hungry may really disrupt your sleep. I know for me personally, I can't go to bed hungry. I also know that if I eat a really big dinner right before bed, like I have a very difficult time sleeping. So finding your sweet spot. Maybe it's 2 hours before bed. Maybe it's 3 hours before bed. Maybe it's an hour and a half. Really big takeaway here is just let's take a look at our dinner patterns and how they may affect our sleep, both as it relates to what we're eating and when we're eating, but also how much we're eating. So again, maybe you're not intentionally intermittent fasting, but you're just not eating enough during the day. And that lends to having a normal dinner, but then needing a lot of snacks to sort of make up for what we didn't eat early in the day. And you see, oh, when I do that, I have a harder time falling asleep. So from a logistic standpoint, it's probably not going to feel really good if we eat a big meal and then lay down. We want gravity to sort of work in our favor with digestion. And if we lay down shortly after we eat, some of that food may just be hanging out in the stomach. We may sort of feel like that pressure and that may disrupt our sleep. But beyond that, those elevated levels of blood sugar may lead us to sweating during the night. We may feel restless or agitated before bed. We may have to go to the bathroom more during the night. And so it could affect our sleep by maybe delaying when we're able to fall asleep or even just causing like these disruptions when we are finally asleep. And so this is where, again, maybe focusing on a dinner that supports that good blood sugar control is going to be helpful. So this could look like having a meal that has some lean protein in it and some fiber, which is going to sort of slow down that blood sugar release, and doing our best to choose carbs that have a bit of fiber as well so that they're not absorbed too quickly, because that may lead to blood sugar spikes. Again, not something that we have to be overly perfectionist with. I think overthinking your food choices at night, if that causes stress and that disrupts your sleep, then that would be a net negative. But focusing on meals that are nice and balanced, again, when we pair carbohydrates with things like protein and fiber, that helps to sort of blunt that blood sugar response. Another way to sort of support that blood sugar control at night, going for a post-dinner walk, even if it's really short, this could be 5 minutes. That movement that we do after a meal, that's going to support that blood sugar control because we are going to be taking the energy that we got from those carbohydrates and putting them to use pretty immediately by doing any sort of movement. So a short stroll after we eat can be really, really helpful for supporting that blood sugar control as well. The intent here is not, I ate, I need to burn off calories, so I'm going to go for a walk. The intent is, I ate, walking at night is going to do a couple of things for me. It's going to support that good blood sugar control. It might support that digestion, right? If we think about, again, gravity working in our favor here, not laying down after eating, sometimes that can actually slow digestion. And then this is also going to support circadian rhythm as well. If we think about getting outside at night, especially if we're someone who's been on a computer all day or we've been in a dark office space all day, this is going to signal to the brain that, oh, okay, it's nighttime. And light plays a pretty big role in our circadian rhythm. And so getting outside at night may help with the release of melatonin as well. Next, so while I would definitely never discourage someone from movement, if we think about physical activity being a stressor, and I'm not referencing the post-dinner walk that I just mentioned, but more of this high intensity activity at night, again, we want our cortisol levels to be highest in the morning and lowest at night. If we have this surge of cortisol at night and that then affects the release of melatonin, which helps us to wind down, well, then that physical activity, even though we're burning off energy, if it's leading to cortisol spikes that disrupt our sleep, it might be something worth examining. And there are people who can work out right before bed, have no issue sleeping. But if you notice, again, just being curious about your habits, I sleep much better when my workouts happen earlier in the day. Just something to sort of consider here. And then I think these are other strategies like rethinking your alcohol intake before bed. We know that alcohol can help us wind down. But from research, we see that it can actually reduce our REM sleep. It can reduce our sleep duration. And it can actually cause low blood sugar during sleep. So if you've ever fallen asleep really, really quickly after drinking, but you've woken up, it could be because that low blood sugar is stimulating the release of cortisol, and that's what's sort of causing us to wake up in the middle of the night. Other things I'm sure we've all heard of before, sticking to a consistent sleep-wake cycle. Again, that's going to support a consistent rhythm that the body is on. Avoiding caffeine after lunch. I would also say just watching your caffeine intake in general. So if you are someone who drinks coffee and that coffee is suppressing your appetite, and again, we're not eating breakfast as a result, or we're having multiple coffees in the day instead of eating, and then that lends to, again, this delayed eating schedule or eating a lot at night, even if we're not necessarily having more caffeine later in the day, but if the effects of our earlier caffeine consumption are impacting our eating habits and that impacts our sleep, that's something to sort of just, again, be curious about. We also know getting sunlight in the morning, anywhere between 2 hours after waking up, that's going to help to maintain that regular circadian rhythm. We also see that vitamin D deficiency may impact sleep because vitamin D is involved in the production of melatonin. Again, that hormone that helps us to wind down. I personally recommend getting your vitamin D levels tested before blindly supplementing. The amount of vitamin D that you would need to supplement with to correct a deficiency is going to be different than what you would need as a more maintenance dose. And then, of course, dimming the lights, avoiding blue light, cooling your room before you sleep. We know that our core body temperature dips slightly at night. And so I think anywhere between 60 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit is recommended. Doing anything like breath work or stretching before bed, that's going to help us tap into our rest and digest nervous system, aka our parasympathetic nervous system, which can definitely help us to wind down. There are certain foods and supplements that may help to support sleep by promoting things like melatonin or tryptophan and magnesium. So these could be great foods to include earlier in your day, or if you are hungry before bed and you know that you do best with having a pre-bedtime snack. Again, everyone is different. We could include foods that are high in melatonin. So this looks like tart cherries, pistachios, and oats, for example. We could also include food sources of tryptophan. So things like turkey or eggs or cheese, certain nuts and seeds, and magnesium. So pumpkin seeds, almonds, cashews, oats, bananas. These are all great sources of magnesium. For example, maybe we do a banana with a little bit of nut butter, or a piece of sprouted bread with a little bit of turkey. Especially if we pair those tryptophan-rich foods with a carb, that actually helps tryptophan to cross the blood-brain barrier. And then there are certain supplements like magnesium glycinate. That's going to be the form that's most helpful for sleep. Valerian root, L-theanine, all of these have been studied to support sleep. I think addressing some of the lifestyle factors first can be super helpful, but everyone responds differently. I've tried every supplement in the book, I would say, and I actually didn't respond very well to melatonin. But I will use magnesium glycinate on occasion if I'm struggling. Okay, and again, if you want more information on the specific nutrients that help food that I sort of quickly hit on, please fill out the request form in the show notes. And any studies that were mentioned here, I've linked there as well. As a reminder, if you'd like to book a one-on-one insurance-covered visit with me, you can do so by signing up using the link in my show notes, and you can follow me on Instagram. My handle is Sprout Out Loud. That's one word, SPROUTOUTLOUD. All right, thanks so much for listening.